Welcome to Policy Insights, where we look beyond the headline and ask what the law, the budget, the courts, and the agencies are really telling us. This week's stories move through two major lanes: native sovereignty and veterans policy. At first glance, they may seem separate: sacred site protection, digital gaming, tribal IDs, boarding school repatriation, VA healthcare, facility security, medical cannabis, and suicide prevention. But they all ask the same question. When the federal government promises responsibility, what does that promise mean in practice? We begin in the Black Hills, where Pete Lean and Sons withdrew its graphite drilling permit after tribal opposition, legal action, and direct land defense efforts. The project would have placed 18 drilling sites near a sacred area protected by a buffer created through a 2016 Memorandum of Understanding between the Forest Service and several tribes. Tribes argued that the Forest Service relied on a categorical exclusion to avoid a deeper review under NEPA and the National Historic Preservation Act. The insight is clear. Sovereignty is not only exercised through treaties or court victories, it is also exercised through consultation, sacred site protection, administrative law, public pressure, and tribal unity. This engagement shows that consultation failures remain one of the weakest points in federal permitting, especially as critical minerals and energy projects collide with treaty rights, sacred places, and water protection. That same question of authority is now moving into the digital world. A federal court allowed the Ho-Chunk Nation's Indian Gaming Regulatory Act claim against Kalshi to proceed, while tribes and pueblos in New Mexico also sued the platform. The issue is whether online sports betting-style event contracts can circumvent tribal gaming compacts when bets are placed on tribal land. This may become a major battleground over sovereignty. The Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was built around physical gaming facilities, tribal state compacts, and revenue systems. Prediction markets test whether federal commodities regulation can be used to sidestep tribal authority. The tribal position is direct. If it functions like gambling on Indian land, tribal regulatory rights cannot disappear because a company calls it an event contract. Next up, the Respect Tribal IDs Act, a bipartisan push to improve training for DHS employees, would require immigration enforcement personnel to receive training on tribal IDs, tribal citizenship, and the federal trust responsibility. This follows reports of Native people being questioned, delayed, or detained because federal officers failed to recognize tribal IDs. A tribal ID is not a courtesy card. It is a document issued by a sovereign government. When federal officers reject it, the problem is not just administrative confusion. It is a failure to recognize tribal governmental authority and native citizenship. Recognition also lies at the heart of the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska's NAGPRA case involving two boys who died at Carlisle Indian Industrial School more than 125 years ago. The Fourth Circuit allowed the tribe's lawsuit against the U.S. Army to proceed, holding that NAGPRA can apply to Native children buried without consent in a federal boarding school cemetery. That ruling matters because NAGPRA is not merely a museum law. It is a living sovereignty statute. It gives tribes a legal pathway to bring children home, conduct proper burial, and repair wrongs rooted in federal coercion. Sovereignty is also fought in budgets. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum testified on the proposed fiscal year 2027 interior budget, while Indian country programs faced possible reductions. The House committee memo acknowledged federal treaty and trust obligations to 575 federally recognized tribes, yet proposed cuts affected core tribal programs, including education and trust administration. Representative Adelita Grijalva pressed Burgum on potential cuts to tribal colleges and universities, and he admitted that Interior had not analyzed the economic harm those cuts would cause to rural and tribal communities. That is the lesson. Budget fights are sovereignty fights. An agency can say it respects tribal sovereignty, But if it cuts the resources that allow tribal governments, schools, and communities to function, the practical effect is to weaken self-determination. Not every sovereignty development is loud. On May 15th, BIA approved the Buena Vista Rancheria of Miwok Indians leasing ordinance under the Hearth Act. That allows the tribe to enter leases without further secretarial approval if tribal regulations and environmental review requirements are met. This is quiet governance, but it matters. It moves tribes away from federal permission-based control and toward faster, more direct authority over trust land. Turning to veterans policy, the same test applies. Does federal responsibility translate into real care, safety, staffing, and access? The most legally significant veteran story is Minority Veterans of America's lawsuit challenging VA's reinstated ban on abortion services and abortion counseling. VA's final rule, effective January 30th, 2026, restored pre-2022 exclusions and relied on a DOJ opinion that VA lacks statutory authority to provide abortion or abortion counseling under 38 U.S.C. Section 1710. This is an administrative law fight inside a culture war issue. The questions are whether VA adequately explained its reversal, considered medical risk evidence, and addressed reliance interests. For oversight, the immediate question is practical. If VA says life-saving care remains available, where is the written clinical guidance showing exactly how pregnant veterans are protected in emergencies? That gap between policy and practice also appeared in the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee hearing on VA police operations. GAO reported that VA serves 9 million enrolled veterans at more than 1,300 facilities, with more than 4,300 officers, specialists, and investigators. Yet covert testing in 2025 found that investigators carried a prohibited weapon into all 30 selected facilities without detection. In 25 of 26 tests, staff failed to confront an investigator who appeared to drink from a bottle labeled vodka. That is not a minor finding. It is a system warning. VA facilities are hospitals, but they are also federal facilities that serve patients with complex medical, behavioral health, homelessness, and crisis needs. Congress should require VA to implement risk management standards, set milestones, and tie security to patient safety. Infrastructure is part of that same safety picture. VA announced $596 million in infrastructure improvements during the second quarter of fiscal year 2026, part of $4.8 billion in planned non-recurring maintenance funds. That is good news on paper, but the oversight question is whether the money reaches the highest risk needs: access control, emergency departments, women veterans care, rural access, suicide risk environments, and aging buildings. Medical cannabis also moved forward. The House approved an amendment allowing veterans to receive medical marijuana recommendations through VA doctors rather than outside providers. Current policy lets VA doctors discuss marijuana use, but blocks them from helping with state medical cannabis paperwork. That creates parallel systems, extra costs, and fragmented care. The amendment does not legalize VA cannabis treatment, but it would remove one barrier between veterans and trusted clinicians. Staffing remains another warning sign. Senator Mark Warner criticized the elimination of 1,700 vacant VA positions in Virginia. The word vacant can be misleading. A vacant slot may be bureaucracy, or it may represent planned capacity for mental health, specialty care, women veteran services, nursing, police staffing, claims work, or suicide prevention. The real question is whether eliminating those positions reduces future access. Finally, VA highlighted its Safeguard Veterans pilot, launched in January 2026 in 6 communities. The program aims to connect veterans to coordinated support wherever they first seek help: hospitals, shelters, nonprofits, job centers, faith groups, community clinics, or VA facilities. That is the right direction if measured honestly. Many at-risk veterans are not enrolled in VA care and do not enter through VA's front door. Congress should ask whether the pilot reduces crisis handoffs, improves warm transfers, reaches unenrolled veterans, and supports community partners with real resources. The lesson this week is simple. Rights do not enforce themselves. Trust responsibilities do not fund themselves. Healthcare promises do not implement themselves. Sovereignty and service both depend on what happens at the point of contact. Policy is where law becomes lived experience, and when the system fails in practice, the promise fails with it. That's it for this edition of Policy Insights. I'm Dr. Eric Hannell. Thank you for listening.